The room froze the instant Mr. Donaldson sneered. Try sounding educated, turning Annalise's careful reading into an open wound. From the back row, Keenan pushed back his chair, its scrape louder than any shout, and declared, "You don't talk to her like that," naming the racism everyone else had swallowed. In that breathless silence, 28 eighth graders realized walls can crack when one quiet kid decides the truth matters more than permission. Hi, everyone. Today we're starting with a moment that turned a silent classroom into the spark of something much bigger. It begins with a teacher who should have known better, a student who never wanted to stand out, and another who spoke when it mattered most. You might think this couldn't happen in your town, your school, or your life, but it can, it does. And sometimes it only takes one sentence to reveal what's been ignored for far too long. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let's begin. Westmere Middle School didn't look like much from the outside. It sat in a quiet corner of town just past a row of faded stop signs and gas stations that still charged more for air than anyone thought was fair. The bricks were weather-worn, the cafeteria smelled faintly of overcooked broccoli, and the hallways echoed with the sound of too small sneakers and half-whispered gossip. But on that morning in room 2B, something cracked open, and it wasn't the usual chatter about locker combinations or who was getting what phone for Christmas. 8th grade English first period. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a faulty vent in the corner let out too much heat for a spring day. The class had just started reading Of Mice and Men, and Mr. Donaldson, 58 years old, salt and pepper hair combed like he still believed it mattered, stood at the front of the room flipping through his dog-eared copy. He cleared his throat the way he always did before handing off the floor. Let's pick up where we left off. Annalise, why don't you read the next paragraph? All eyes drifted toward her. Annalise Carter sat in the third row, second seat from the left. 14 years old, hair pulled back into a neat puff. She had a quiet elegance about her, always early to class, always prepared, always respectful. The kind of student teachers usually wanted more of. But with Mr. Donaldson, something never quite clicked. She lifted her book, cleared her throat softly, and began. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. She read with care, letting the rhythm of the words carry her. She loved this book, not for the plot, but because it made her feel something. Something about dignity, about dreams. But before she could finish the sentence, Mr. Donaldson interrupted. "Annalise," he said, his voice slicing through the air like the corner of a cold ruler. "This isn't a slam poetry session on a subway platform. Try reading it like someone who's actually been educated." The room shifted, that fast. One or two students blinked. A few looked down at their desks. A boy near the back mumbled, "Whoa," under his breath, like he wasn't sure he'd just heard what he heard. The heater kept humming. The clock kept ticking. But something inside the room stopped. Annalise didn't move. Her lips stayed slightly parted, her hands frozen on the paperback in her lap. Her eyes locked on the words, but they no longer made sense. The sentence blurred. Her fingers tightened just a little on the page. She didn't look up. Not at her classmates, not at Mr. Donaldson. And Mr. Donaldson, he just stood there, arms crossed, looking over his glasses like he'd corrected a typo, like she'd mispronounced a word and not been reduced to a stereotype in front of 27 other kids. No one laughed. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know how. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like something else, something heavier, like a thread had snapped, but nobody wanted to be the one to say they heard it break. Annalise lowered her book just slightly. No tears, no sound, just stillness. One girl sitting beside her, Brielle, darted a glance toward the front, then back to Annalise. Her eyes said it. That wasn't right. And in the far back corner by the crooked window where the blinds never fully closed, one chair scraped against the tile floor. Not loud, just intentional. Keenan Boyd stood up, 13 years old, lanky, always wore that oversized gray hoodie no matter the weather. Quiet to the point most kids forgot he was there. But not today. He didn't raise his hand, didn't wait to be called on. He just stood and said it. You don't talk to people like that, especially not her. It was soft, steady, calm, but it hit like thunder. Mr. Donaldson turned, his brows lifted behind his glasses. "Excuse me," he said sharp. Keenan didn't flinch. You heard me. Then louder. You wouldn't say that to anyone else in this room. He paused. You said it because she's black. The words landed like stones on glass. Nobody moved. A few students looked around, searching for permission to react. One girl put her hand over her mouth. Another boy leaned forward like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mr. Donaldson took a step forward. That's enough, he said, trying to sound firm. But it didn't land. Not the way he wanted. Not anymore. Keenan kept standing. You were wrong. Just admit it. Mr. Donaldson's jaw twitched. Sit down, Keenan. We can talk after class. But he didn't sit. Not yet. He stood for a second longer, eyes steady. Then quietly he said, You embarrassed her in front of everyone. That's not teaching. And then he sat. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a protest. But it was enough. The rest of the period crawled forward. Mr. Donaldson handed out a worksheet no one was prepared for. Busy work. His voice stayed flat, and he didn't look at anyone. He just wrote instructions on the board while his hand trembled slightly. The confidence he usually wore like armor had slipped. Annalise never picked up her pencil. She didn't cry. She didn't blink much either. She just sat there quiet like someone caught between two doors. The bell rang at 9:48 a.m., not a second too soon, as students packed up a few patted Keenan on the back, quick, subtle quiet. Annalise stood slowly. She didn't speak, but Keenan gave her a look. Not a smile, just a nod, like he wanted her to know you weren't alone. And then the hallway swallowed them up, and the story began to spread like wildfire. By the time second period started, the story had already made its way down the math hallway and into the band room. It slipped between lockers and cafeteria tables into text threads and whispered recaps that changed slightly with every telling. But the one thing no one got wrong, Keenan Boyd had stood up to Mr. Donaldson, in front of everyone, and called him out. Not yelled, not screamed, just said what needed to be said. And while half the school couldn't believe it, the other half had already started wondering why no one had done it sooner. In room 2B, English class carried on like nothing had happened, at least on the surface. But the silence had changed. The students didn't lean back in their chairs as much. Nobody slouched or whispered behind textbooks. Even Brielle, who usually doodled hearts on her worksheets, kept her eyes forward. And Mr. Donaldson, he didn't look up once. Meanwhile, down near the nurse's office, Annalise sat on a small vinyl couch, hugging her backpack close. Her face was blank. Not frozen from fear, but from everything that came after it. She hadn't cried. Not even when Nurse Taylor gently asked if she was okay. She'd just shaken her head and said she didn't feel well. That was enough. The nurse called her mom, and 20 minutes later, Dr. Vanessa Carter walked in, still wearing her white coat, her ID badge clipped to her scrub top, and her expression already tight. She didn't ask questions at first, just pulled her daughter in for a hug and sat beside her. When she finally spoke, her voice was low even. Tell me what he said. Annalise hesitated. He said, I sounded like I was doing slam poetry on a subway platform, then told me to sound like someone educated. Dr. Carter didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. When she did, it wasn't loud. Where is he? I think he's still teaching, Annalise said almost apologetically, as if she were the one who had done something wrong. Her mother stood. Then I need to speak to the principal. That same morning, in a smaller, older house on the south side of town, Marshall Boyd had just gotten home from his morning shift at the post office when the call came in. He had barely kicked off his boots when the school's number flashed on his phone. Keenan hadn't done anything wrong, they said, but he'd spoken out in class, and they needed to discuss the incident. 10 minutes later, he was pulling on a jacket, keys in hand. Marshall Boyd didn't rush. He didn't need to. But if you saw the way he walked across the school's front lot, you'd understand why no one stopped him. Former Marine. Still stood like one. And when he entered the front office, the woman at the reception desk didn't even ask his name. She just pointed toward the conference room. Inside, Principal Ronan Hess was already waiting. Tall, balding, with glasses that always slid down the bridge of his nose. He looked more like a nervous uncle than a school leader, and today he wasn't hiding it. Mr. Boyd, he began standing quickly. Thank you for coming in. Where's my son in class for now? Hess said. We didn't think it was necessary to remove him. He's not in trouble. We just... Well, I wanted to speak with you directly. There was an incident this morning in Mr. Donaldson's class. I know, Boyd said, folding his arms. I already heard. My son stood up for someone who was humiliated. The principal blinked. So he told you, every word. And, do you believe his actions were appropriate for the classroom setting? I believe they were necessary. Now tell me, what's the school doing about the teacher? Hess sighed. We're conducting an internal review. There have been some concerns brought forward in the past, but nothing formal until now. Marshall leaned forward slightly. Maybe that's part of the problem. Elsewhere, word kept spreading. A student named Javier, who had barely spoken to Keenan all year, was the first to say it out loud in fourth period science. That wasn't about being disrespectful. That was about respect that's never been given. And suddenly, students started whispering their own stories. About the time Mr. Donaldson told a Latina student her accent would make reading Shakespeare difficult. About when he told a boy from the foster system that maybe college wasn't for everyone. Little things, individually forgettable, but now remembered all at once. By fifth period, teachers were talking too, quietly, in break rooms, in emails with subject lines like FYI student concern, and have you heard the district office received a pair of voicemails before noon? One anonymous, one not. That afternoon, Annalise stayed home. Her mother told the school they'd return for a meeting the next morning. Meanwhile, Keenan stayed silent through most of the day. But when lunch came, he didn't sit at his usual empty table. He sat next to Brielle and two other students who usually didn't speak to him. You good, one of them asked. Keenan shrugged. Yeah, just didn't like what he said. You think you're going to get in trouble? No. Why not? He paused. Because I didn't lie. They all nodded. Like that was enough. Later that day, when Mr. Donaldson walked into the faculty lounge, three teachers stopped talking. He grabbed a coffee cup from the cabinet, poured half a mug, then left without a word. He didn't meet anyone's eye, and no one called after him. But the silence. That was loud. That evening at home, Keenan sat on the floor of his bedroom sketching. He didn't draw the classroom or Mr. Donaldson. He drew a line of people, all standing, one behind the other, each taller than the last, like someone had started something, and others had followed. And down the hall, Annalise sat on her bed with a journal open beside her and a pen in her hand. She hadn't written anything yet, but she would. The next morning, the air around Westmere Middle felt tight. Not in any physical way, there was no police tape or media vans, but in the way people whispered instead of spoke in, how teachers paused when walking past each other in the halls, in the way students kept glancing at their phones like they were waiting for something big to drop. Something already had, but no one was sure what came next. At 9:15 a.m., Annalise and her mother, Dr. Vanessa Carter, stepped through the front office doors. Dr. Carter was still in scrubs teal blue, with the name of her pediatric clinic embroidered over her heart. She'd already worked 4 hours that morning, but you wouldn't know it by her posture. Her bun was neat, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp as cut glass. Principal Ronan Hess met them in the main conference room. There was already a pitcher of water on the table, some unused notepads, and a few empty chairs. He greeted them with a strained smile, gesturing for them to sit. Thank you for coming, he began. Dr. Carter sat but didn't relax. I'm not here for pleasantries. I want to know why my daughter was insulted in front of an entire classroom by someone on your payroll. Hess cleared his throat. I understand, and I want to assure you we're taking this seriously. Mr. Donaldson is currently under review. We've initiated a formal investigation through the district. Has he been removed from the classroom? Not yet. Annalise flinched at that. Her mother caught it instantly. Then you're not taking it seriously? Please understand there's a process. We've reached out to human resources and we're beginning interviews. I want to be clear, Dr. Carter said. This wasn't a disagreement about curriculum. This wasn't classroom management. This was racial humiliation. Principal Hess didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, cautiously. At 10:25 a.m., in a separate meeting room down the hall, Marshall Boyd sat across the table from the assistant principal, a school counselor, and a district representative who had driven down from the regional office that morning. Keenan was by his side, not saying much, just fidgeting with the zipper on his hoodie. Your son's conduct wasn't disruptive, the district rep said, but it was unconventional. We want to make sure we understand the full picture. Marshall leaned forward. What exactly is unconventional about standing up for someone who was being mistreated? The room fell quiet. The district rep shifted in her seat. Keenan finally spoke, voice low but firm. I didn't say anything to get attention. I said it because it was wrong, and nobody else was going to say it. The counselor nodded slowly. Did you feel unsafe? No, Keenan said, but I think Annalise did. Meanwhile, across the school, more students were beginning to talk. In gym class, someone said, remember what he told Miguel last year about how his English needed work? In the art room, someone else added, he told my sister to pick a more realistic college. It wasn't just about Annalise anymore. It never had been. By lunchtime, the district office had received 4 additional calls, 2 from current parents, 1 from a teacher, and 1 from a former student who had graduated 2 years ago. Her message was simple. Glad someone finally said something. I never forgot what he said to me junior year. The story began spreading beyond the school walls. Local Facebook groups lit up with cryptic posts. Something happened at Westmere. Anyone else hearing about a teacher being called out by 3 p.m.? A small education blog run by a former district teacher published a short entry. Sources confirm Westmere Middle School investigating veteran teacher for alleged discriminatory comments. No names were listed, but people started connecting the dots. Inside, the school, teachers were holding whispered conversations in corners. Some defended Mr. Donaldson. He's old school, that's all. Others looked uneasy. I mean, this isn't the first time something like this has come up. In the staff lounge, a history teacher said aloud what many were only thinking. It's not about intent. It's about impact. And if he made a student feel ashamed of her own voice, that is the problem. Later that afternoon, Principal Hess called both families and confirmed there would be a joint meeting scheduled for the next morning. District leadership will be present, he said. We want this resolved with full transparency. Resolved. That word echoed in Annalise's mind when her mom told her. She wasn't sure what resolved meant. An apology, a punishment, or just an official way to say, let's move on. She didn't want revenge, but she did want something more than silence. That night at home, Annalise sat at her desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of her. She didn't know if she was writing a speech, a letter, or just a place to put her thoughts. But the first line she wrote was this: when someone takes your voice, the hardest thing is believing it still belongs to you. And across town, in a house full of old service medals and faded comic books, Keenan sat on the floor of his bedroom drawing again. This time, it was a classroom. Not his. Not exactly. But it was full of students standing facing forward. And at the front, where a teacher would usually be, there was a mirror. The next morning, the main office conference room didn't feel like part of a middle school. It felt like a courtroom. The long oak table had been cleared of its usual clutter. A few printouts sat in neat stacks at each seat. The clock ticked just a little too loud, and the air from the vent above blew cold, even though spring sun poured through the windows. Principal Ronan Hess sat at one end of the table, palms folded neatly. Beside him was Assistant Principal Cheryl Madsen, hands clasped in her lap. Across from them sat 2 district officials, one from Human Resources, the other from Student Equity and Inclusion. At the opposite end, Mr. Donaldson adjusted the cuffs of his shirt like he was trying to remember how to be comfortable in his own skin. He didn't look around, didn't make eye contact. Then the door opened. Dr. Vanessa Carter stepped in first, followed closely by her daughter Annalise. She wore a soft gray cardigan over her uniform shirt. Her eyes didn't scan the room, they locked onto the empty chair meant for her. She sat quietly, folded her hands, and said nothing. Seconds later, Marshall Boyd entered with Keenan. His steps were steady, purposeful. Keenan followed behind him, sketchbook clutched in one arm, a pen tucked behind his ear. No one spoke right away. Hess waited for the door to click shut behind them before clearing his throat. Thank you all for coming. We're here today to address what happened in Mr. Donaldson's 8th grade English class 2 days ago. Mr. Donaldson looked up at last briefly. Our goal, Hess continued, is to make sure every voice is heard, that no one walks away feeling dismissed or silenced. Dr. Carter, would you like to begin? She didn't flinch. Yes, I would. She turned to face Mr. Donaldson directly. You told my daughter to stop sounding like a slam poet on a subway platform. You said to try sounding like someone educated. Her voice didn't rise, but every syllable landed. Would you have said the same thing if her skin were lighter? I didn't mean it that way, Mr. Donaldson said quickly. But you said it, Marshall Boyd replied from across the table. Loud enough for every child in that room to hear. I was trying to redirect, Donaldson said now, looking at the district rep instead of the parents. I thought her tone was too stylized. I meant to coach, not offend. You mocked Keenan, said his voice quiet but steady. Everyone turned to him. He hadn't spoken since entering the room. You didn't coach her. You embarrassed her. Mr. Donaldson looked back at him, mouth slightly open. And you said it like you wanted the other kids to laugh, Keenan added. They didn't, Annalise whispered. The room fell into silence for several seconds. The district equity officer finally broke it. Mr. Donaldson, have you previously received concerns regarding language or conduct in your classroom? There were comments, he said slowly, over the years, but nothing formal, nothing ever proven. Principal Hess shifted in his seat. I've reviewed 2 prior complaints, he said. Both were documented and discussed with administration. One involved comments about student accents, another about discouraging certain college plans. We addressed them internally, but nothing changed, Dr. Carter said. Mr. Donaldson sat back looking smaller now. The HR official adjusted her glasses. At this time, based on the current investigation and past concerns, you will be placed on administrative leave pending final district review. You are not to return to the classroom until further notice. He didn't argue. He just nodded once. No tears, no outburst, just resignation. The meeting didn't end with applause or cheering. It ended with a soft breath from Annalise, a shift in her shoulders. Keenan leaned back in his chair sketchbook, resting across his lap again. On the way out as they passed the hallway bulletin board, covered in last month's book reports, Keenan stopped for a second. A laminated quote from To Kill a Mockingbird was pinned near the top. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. He stared at it. Then he pulled the pen from behind his ear and wrote something at the bottom of a scrap flyer, pinned underneath. Some people just never try. He didn't sign it. Later that day, an email went out to all faculty and parents. Due to a recent incident in one of our classrooms, Westmere Middle School will be hosting a student-led forum on the topic of respect in education. This will be an open dialogue between students and staff supported by district leadership. All students are encouraged to attend. Teachers are welcome and encouraged to participate. Some students read it with excitement, others with caution. A few rolled their eyes, but nobody ignored it. In the teacher's lounge, the silence wasn't quite so thick anymore. Benning, the art teacher, broke it first. You know, I had a student last year who stopped raising her hand after Donaldson laughed at her pronunciation. Mr. Porter, the social studies teacher, nodded. I had one too. Wouldn't even volunteer to read after October. I just assumed he was being tough, another whispered. He was being careless, Benning replied, and now it's all catching up. At home, Annalise read and reread the email on her mom's phone. Then she went to her notebook and began writing again. Not out of anger, not even sadness, just clarity. And down the street, Keenan closed his sketchbook. His dad had already gone to bed. The house was quiet, but he kept replaying the meeting in his head, not the parts with shouting or accusations, just the silence, the kind that meant people had finally heard you. The school board meeting fell on a chilly Thursday evening, yet the auditorium felt crowded enough to warm every seat. Students in hoodies lined the back wall, parents squeezed into rows, and teachers stood against the side aisles, holding coffee that had long gone cold. At the front sat the 7 board members, their microphones blinking red. News of Mr. Donaldson's leave had already leaked, but people wanted to see accountability with their own eyes. One by one, they approached the podium first, a grandmother who'd raised 3 Westmere graduates, then a first-year science teacher who confessed she'd once muted her own accent for fear of being mocked. When Annalise stepped forward, she carried a single sheet of notebook paper. Her voice quivered for only the first 3 words, "I love words." The hush that followed allowed her to finish a short statement about how words can open or close doors, how one sentence can make a 14-year-old question her right to be heard. Applause swelled, gentle at first, then firm. Marshall Boyd approached next, towering yet calm. If speaking up for someone is wrong, he told the board, then as adults we've forgotten our purpose. Nobody clapped, nobody had to. The silence was loud enough. By night's end, the board announced the district would complete its review within 10 business days and issue a public report. It wasn't a final verdict, but everyone felt the tide turn. The verdict arrived sooner than expected. On Monday morning, inboxes buzzed with an official memo: Mr. Donaldson has chosen to retire effective immediately. A search for a permanent replacement begins at once. No farewell cake, no staff photo. Just an empty parking spot and a classroom waiting for fresh air. A long-term substitute named Miss Arnett greeted Period 1 with a warm, "Good morning, scholars," and the students blinked. No one had called them that before. Midweek, Miss Arnett invited volunteers to share original writing. Annalise raised her hand. She stood unfolded a poem she'd written at 2:07 a.m. and read about reclaiming space, about how a voice isn't a privilege but a birthright. She never mentioned Mr. Donaldson yet, every line threaded through the silence he'd left behind. When she finished, no one clapped. Instead, Keenan whispered, "Thank you," and that single word felt louder than applause. At lunch, students huddled over the new flyer, taped to the cafeteria door: Respect in Education Forum. Thursday after school, students lead teachers listen. Some stared, some snapped pictures, but nobody tore it down. Thursday arrived. Folding chairs filled the library rows, snaking between bookshelves. At the front sat Keenan and Annalise with 2 index cards, each questions on one side, blank hope on the other. They opened with a simple prompt: describe a time you felt small in class. Hands rose slowly. A 7th grader spoke about being told his name was too hard to pronounce. An 8th grade girl recalled hiding her southern twang. Teachers listened, really listened, some jotting notes, others wiping eyes. The district equity officer facilitated but never dominated. The students steered the current. Near the end, Keenan shared his sketchbook on a document camera, images of students standing tall before mirrors instead of teachers. The room inhaled as one. When the forum adjourned, Principal Hess promised monthly sessions and unveiled a professional development series on unconscious bias, mandatory not voluntary. Outside, twilight painted the sky salmon pink, and clusters of students lingered, reluctant to let the momentum slip back into routine. Spring melted into early June. In the east hallway, a new bulletin board appeared: Words that stayed with us. Students posted sticky notes quoting things that had hurt and words that had healed. A teacher added her own: You belong here, and your story matters. Training sessions filled teacher workroom calendars. Some staff grumbled, yet even they showed up curiosity outweighing pride. The local newspaper ran a feature titled Middle Schoolers Lead Lesson in Courage, spotlighting Annalise's poem and Keenan's quiet defiance. Colleges sent emails asking permission to reprint the poem in first-year seminars about voice and identity. But the biggest change arrived in the smallest moments: a teacher pausing to ask, "Did that comment land the way I intended?" A student correcting a peer without fear of backlash. A guidance counselor hanging a sign that read, "Silence is not your ally." On the last day of school, Keenan slipped Annalise a final sketch: 2 figures standing under a banner that read, started with a sentence, grew into a choir. She tucked it into her backpack next to battered novels and a future wide enough for all their voices. The bell has rung, the hallways are emptying, and now it's just you and me for a softer moment. Take a slow breath with me. Inhale through your nose for a steady count of 4, hold it for 4, then let it out like a gentle sigh. That's how healing begins, one measured breath after the chaos. Maybe tonight you'll sit on your porch with a warm mug of chamomile, listening to cicadas instead of comment section noise. Remember Annalise when you feel tempted to shrink so others stay comfortable. Remember Keenan when your heart pounds at the thought of speaking up in the grocery line, the board meeting, or even the family dinner table. Justice isn't always a courtroom gavel. Sometimes it's a 13-year-old whispering truth into a brittle silence. And power is just a borrowed coat that slips off when enough people tug at the seams. If a middle school library can transform into a forum for respect, then your living room, your church basement, your local coffee shop can do the same. So tonight, as you rinse your dishes or set out your morning pill organizer, ask yourself where a small act of courage might fit between breakfast and bedtime. Write it down on a sticky note, tuck it under the magnet shaped like a golden retriever on your fridge, and let it nudge you tomorrow. Older or younger, busy or bored, We are all still students, and the lesson is clear silence can be broken, and when it breaks, something better can grow in the space it leaves behind. Sleep well, friend, and wake ready to lend your voice.